When champagne splashed across my face, the liquid stung my eyes and soaked into the fabric of my carefully chosen dress. Its sting was not just physical. It burned far deeper, searing into the very core of my dignity. I stood frozen for a moment, my breath catching in my throat, the bitter scent of alcohol invading my senses. It was supposed to be a moment of welcome, an introduction to the family of the man I thought I might marry. Instead, it became the moment I realized the fragility of dreams and the cruelty that can hide behind polished smiles. Her voice cut through the stunned silence, sharp, mocking, triumphant. How about that, you poor thing? I've eliminated the smell of poverty for you. You should be grateful. Those words came from Kelly, the woman who was to be my mother-in-law, a woman whose approval I had been anxious to secure. Instead, she looked at me as though I were filth to be washed away with sparkling wine. And then what hurt more than the liquid or her sneer was the laughter. It wasn't hers, it was Jan's, my fiancé, my supposed partner, the man who, instead of stepping between me and cruelty, chose to laugh as though it were some private joke at my expense. Something inside me cracked in that moment. The emptiness that followed was almost merciful. It was a hollowing out that dulled the sharp edge of humiliation. I stood tall even as my clothes clung wetly to my skin, even as my carefully styled hair sagged into damp strands. I steadied my breath and let silence hang for a moment before I spoke. I will therefore terminate our contract with your company. The words came out steady, sharper than I expected. Jan and Kelly both gasped, their arrogance crumbling into confusion. They had expected me to cry, to plead, to shrink. They did not expect the woman before them to stand resolute to sever not just an engagement but a business tie that underpinned their security. And then from the corner of the room, President Coleman appeared, Jan's father, the man I had known for years in the professional world. His face paled as my words echoed through the hall. I turned my gaze to him, calm and composed despite the sting of champagne still dripping down my face. "Mr. Coleman," I said quietly, "you once mentioned that you intended to retire soon to hand over your duties to your son. Given what has happened here today, it is reasonable to reconsider how much my company can trust a future business leader like him." His lips parted, but no words came. In that silence, I felt the weight of decades of business relationships, of contracts and trusts suddenly shatter like glass. I bowed slightly, then turned on my heel, leaving behind not just the champagne-stained room, but also the illusions I had carried about Jan and his family. My name is Tana Hall. I am 48 years old. I have never married. For most of my life, I have devoted myself to work, to the solitude I cherished through books, films, and quiet evenings where my thoughts were my only company. I told myself I didn't need marriage, didn't need a man to validate my existence. But life has a way of testing the walls we build. That spring, when the flowers bloomed brightly under April skies, an unexpected marriage proposal came my way. It was introduced by Douglas Coleman, President Coleman, someone I had known professionally for years. "Miss Hall," he had said warmly, "I would very much like to introduce you to someone. My son Jan, how about it?" I had been hesitant. Marriage was not something I ever chased. But Douglas's insistence wore me down, and curiosity urged me forward. I met Jan with no expectations, telling myself it would be nothing more than polite conversation. He was my age, the youngest son of President Coleman, and though he had come close to marriage before, he had never quite managed it. Our first meeting was cautious, even awkward, yet I found myself intrigued. Jan was polite, attentive, even kind in those early moments. There was something vulnerable about him, a softness that contrasted with the hardened men I had often encountered in boardrooms. I thought perhaps it is not too late for me. I suggested we date. President Coleman was pleased. Jan seemed delighted. For a moment, everything seemed possible. But within weeks, the cracks began to show. On our third date, Jan wore a casual jacket, his demeanor more relaxed than before. We dined at a slightly upscale restaurant, and I watched with amusement as he bragged about the place as though it were a secret treasure. "You wouldn't normally get to come to a place like this, right? It must be unusual for you." His words stung, though I smiled politely. In truth, I had eaten there only 3 days earlier with friends. It was one of my favorites. But I swallowed my pride, not wanting to embarrass him. Still, a seed of doubt planted itself inside me. Later, his gaze fell on my handbag, a piece specially crafted for me at a workshop in Italy. It was simple, elegant, without any garish logos. "Don't you have a proper bag?" he asked. "Something more prestigious?" I forced a smile. He could not see the craftsmanship, the quiet luxury that didn't scream for attention. He only saw what lacked a brand name, what he thought marked me as lesser. And then there was the buffet incident. Jan piled his plate high with food, far more than he could possibly finish. When I gently cautioned him against wasting so much, he laughed. "A waste, Tana? Are you still talking like someone poor? It doesn't matter if I throw it away." I clenched my fists under the table, anger flaring hot. It wasn't about money. It was about respect for the food, for the people who prepared it, for the world we lived in. When I confronted him, he shrank back like a scolded child, murmuring an apology. Then, almost as if it excused him, he added, "My mommy said you might be marrying me for money." And I just reacted without thinking. Mommy. The word echoed in my ears, foreign and jarring from the mouth of a man nearing 50. It told me everything about the boy. He still was trapped in the shell of a man. And yet, when he asked me to marry him, I felt a strange flutter of joy. Despite the flaws, despite the condescension and immaturity, there was a tenderness in his persistence. I told myself love required patience, that people could grow, that perhaps I could nurture him into the partner I longed for. I agreed. Tears pricked my eyes as I whispered, "Let's grow together. We both have flaws. Let's talk, resolve them, and build something real." But almost immediately he crushed that fragile hope. "Let's start preparing for married life," he said with a smile. "First, you should quit your job. Take care of the home. Learn from my mommy." It felt as though he had slapped me across the face. My job, my company, was my life's work. To abandon it, to be reduced to a housewife under his mother's supervision, fury roared inside me. "Don't be so presumptuous," I snapped. "If that's your attitude, marriage is out of the question. Goodbye." I stormed out, leaving him stunned in the car. But he came back apologetic, begging me to reconsider. He admitted his friends had told him to lay down the law and that he had been foolish to listen. Against my better judgment, I relented. I told myself he was simply misguided, easily influenced, but essentially honest. I clung to the belief that honesty could be enough. A month later, it was time to meet his family formally. I had known President Coleman for years, but never in his home. I told myself if I approached Kelly sincerely, she would understand. That hope was crushed the instant champagne hit my face. Jan laughed, Kelly sneered. And in that moment I understood the truth. I had been naive. I had mistaken immaturity for innocence, weakness for honesty, and cruelty for mere misunderstanding. I realized that love built on illusion cannot stand. I walked away from that house with my head held high. Though my clothes were damp and clinging uncomfortably to me, though the sting of humiliation still clung to my skin. Each step away from them felt like shedding a layer of shame. I didn't look back, not even once. For if I had, I might have seen Jan still clutching at his mother's hand like a child, and I feared that sight would only deepen the ache inside me. Back at home, the silence pressed down heavily. I sat alone, staring at the faint champagne stains on my dress. It was strange how a liquid meant for celebration had turned into a weapon of humiliation. The more I thought of Kelly's sneer and Jan's laughter, the more I realized how deeply I had deceived myself. I thought of my parents, of the sacrifices they made, of the values they instilled in me: respect, dignity, hard work. Would they not have been crushed to see me reduced to a laughingstock in someone else's dining room? No, I couldn't allow this. I wouldn't. I reminded myself I was not just a woman seeking companionship. I was Tana Hall, a businesswoman who had built something from nothing, who had carved her name into an industry dominated by men. I was not desperate. I was not weak. And I certainly was not poor, no matter how Kelly and Jan tried to paint me. But the cruelest irony was that they had no idea who I truly was. From the very beginning, I had hidden my identity. When Douglas Coleman introduced me to his son, I chose to keep my position as president of my company a secret. I didn't want Jan to see me as a title, as a bank account, as a stepping stone to something greater. I wanted him to see me as a woman, to choose me, not the weight of what I carried. So I disguised myself. I wore simple glasses. I styled my hair differently. I downplayed my clothing, choosing subtlety over statements. And all the while I studied him, looking for sincerity, for genuine character. That was my test, and he failed. When I revealed my truth in front of his parents, that I was not some ordinary woman, but the head of one of their most important partner companies, Jan's face went pale. Kelly's lips quivered. Even President Coleman, who had once seemed so steady, looked shaken. I laid the business card on the table like a blade. This, I said calmly, is my position. For over 10 years, my company has worked alongside yours. We are, in fact, your largest client. I wonder how much of your sales we represent. Would you care to calculate the percentage? The silence in the room was deafening. Jan's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His eyes darted between me, his father, and his mother as if hoping someone would whisper that it was a joke. Kelly's face turned red, then white. She stammered, but no words came. And then came the truth they could not deny. Their company was in trouble. Declining market share, outdated systems, inefficient processes, things I had known for months. I had even considered moving our contracts to another firm. I told them this plainly, without malice, only with the honesty they lacked. Kelly lashed out, accusing me of blackmail, of cruelty. Her words came fast and shrill. How dare you threaten us based on personal feelings? What a despicable act. I didn't even need to reply, for in that moment, President Coleman slammed his fist on the table. Silence. This is all your fault. The air shattered like glass under his voice. Kelly recoiled, shocked. Jan clung harder to her hand, trembling. And I, watching this family crumble in front of me, felt only one thing: relief. Relief that I had seen the truth before it was too late. Relief that I would not tie myself to a man who could not stand without his mother, nor to a woman whose pride was as hollow as her heart. Jan tried in his own pitiful way to defend himself. He sneered at me, accusing me of lying about my position, of pretending to be something I was not. He even mocked the bag I carried, saying no company president would own something so plain. I smiled faintly. This bag, I explained softly, was custom-made by an Italian craftsman. It is worth more than the logos you worship. But quality is not something everyone can recognize. Those who understand, understand. His face flushed with anger, his immaturity naked for all to see. Then came the final blow, not from me, but from his father. With a trembling voice, President Coleman begged me not to abandon their company. If you withdraw, he said, we will be ruined. Please, forgive us. Forgive. The word rang hollow. How could I forgive a son who laughed at my humiliation? A mother who saw me as beneath her forgiveness would mean binding myself to their decay, their cruelty. I could not. I cannot consider marrying into this family, I said firmly. The engagement is over. President Coleman's shoulders slumped. His eyes closed as if he were carrying the weight of not just failure, but shame. For once, Kelly had no words. And Jan, he simply whimpered, "Mommy," like a child. That night, as I sat alone in my home, I thought of everything. The champagne, the laughter, the cruelty, the pleading. And I realized with a clarity I hadn't felt in years that love is not worth sacrificing dignity. No matter how lonely, no matter how tempting the idea of companionship, I would never again abandon the woman I had built myself into. The weeks that followed only confirmed my choice. Within months, President Coleman resigned. The shame of the incident had spread through whispers in the business community, and his declining company could no longer be ignored. His departure was painted as retirement, but everyone knew the truth. His successor, no longer bound by family pride, began rebuilding, stripping away inefficiencies, seeking innovation. Jan and Kelly, meanwhile, fell from their pedestal. They moved out together, clinging to each other like drowning sailors. But the gossip that reached me painted a grim picture: constant fights, financial strain, resentment. Kelly, who once sneered at me as poor, now struggled to pay her rent, her luxurious lifestyle slipping through her fingers like sand. And Jan, the nearly 50-year-old man who still called his mother Mommy, found himself adrift, jobless, purposeless, his dependence only deepening the cracks in their relationship. When I heard that Kelly eventually abandoned him too, leaving him to his father's reluctant care, I felt no joy, no vindication, only a quiet sorrow. It was not revenge, though it may have seemed so from the outside. It was karma, inevitable and unyielding. Years passed. My own company thrived stronger than ever. The scars of humiliation faded, replaced by a deeper sense of self than I had ever known. My parents, who once fretted over my unmarried state, came to see the wisdom of my choices. They supported me when I told them the truth of what happened. And me, I chose myself. I chose solitude, hobbies, new passions, strength. For the first time in my life, I began exercising, building not just muscles but resilience. My employees admired me, my peers respected me, and I finally respected myself without reservation. Sometimes I still wonder, if Jan had been different, if Kelly had welcomed me kindly, would I have chosen a different path? Would I have been a wife, a daughter-in-law, part of their empire? The answer no longer matters. Because I see now that what happened was not a tragedy, but a liberation. It has been said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. I should have listened to that wisdom. The signs were always there. The condescension about restaurants I had long frequented, the mocking glance at my handbag, the childish clinging to his mother's every word. But I silenced the warnings within me. I told myself that people grow, that patience could sculpt character, that love could bloom in unlikely places. I was wrong. Looking back now, I realize I was searching for companionship not out of need, but out of curiosity. I had built a life so full of work, of goals, of lonely evenings with books and films that I wondered, was there something missing? Was there a part of me buried beneath boardrooms and contracts that longed to be held, to be chosen? Perhaps that longing was what blinded me to the truth. When Jan laughed as champagne dripped from my chin, I saw the mirror of my folly. I saw the girl in me, the one who once dreamed of love stories and fairy tale endings, finally die. What remained was the woman who had always been there, hard, steady, forged from years of discipline and solitude. That woman knew what she deserved. But walking away did not mean the story ended. No. The storm that began in that dining room spilled outward, carrying with it consequences no one in the Coleman family could escape. I heard not long after that President Coleman had grown ill under the weight of stress. The company's numbers were plummeting. Rumors swirled of desperate negotiations, of unpaid suppliers, of employees leaving in droves. All of this only confirmed what I had already said, that their structure was outdated, their leadership blind. Without my company's support, their collapse was inevitable. When the resignation came, it was wrapped in polite words. Retirement, the papers said. A new chapter. But I had seen the truth in his eyes on that day, the truth of a man broken not by competition, but by the folly of his own family. Kelly and Jan tried to hold on to the remnants of pride, but pride doesn't pay bills. I was told they fought often, their voices carrying through the thin walls of the small apartment they had retreated to. Neighbors whispered about the once proud woman who now wept over rent, about the son who still called her mommy, as if he were a boy of 10. Their lives had been built on the illusion of wealth and superiority, and when stripped bare there was nothing left but dependence and bitterness. There was a time I would have felt satisfaction at hearing this. A time when I would have thought, this is justice. This is what they deserve. But strangely, I did not feel joy. I felt pity. Because while they mocked me for poverty, I understood something they never did. Poverty is not shameful. Dependence is. And both of them had lived their entire lives dependent on wealth they did not earn, on status they did not create, on appearances that crumbled at the first touch of reality. My path, in contrast, had been the opposite. I had walked through storms alone, built every brick of my company with my own hands, endured sleepless nights and endless sacrifices. When Kelly threw champagne in my face, she thought she was staining me with shame. But in truth, she revealed her own. Months later, I met President Coleman again. No longer in the grand office I had once visited, but in a quiet hallway of his former company. His shoulders seemed smaller, his face etched with lines deeper than I remembered. He bowed, his voice trembling as he said, "I am very sorry for the great inconvenience I caused." I looked at him not with anger, but with a strange compassion. He was a man who had lost his company, his marriage, and the respect of his peers. Yet I could see that he understood his role in the destruction, that by indulging his wife, by failing to raise his son into a man, he had sown the seeds of his downfall. He confessed that Kelly had squandered the property he had given her, that Jan was still incapable of basic tasks. "He doesn't even know how to boil water," he said, shaking his head. "I have taken him in. At my age, I am teaching him how to live like an adult. For a moment, I felt an ache in my chest. Not for Jan, but for the tragedy of wasted potential. A boy who had been given everything and learned nothing. A man who at nearly 50 wept at the thought of chores. But I reminded myself it was not my burden to carry. I had tried once to see potential in him, to believe I could nurture him into a better man. That had been my mistake. People do not change because you will them to. They change only when they are ready to face the emptiness of their own lives. And Jan was still clinging, still calling for mommy. Years passed. My company grew stronger than ever. I found myself surrounded by loyal employees who admired me, who looked to me not just as a leader, but as an example. Some whispered that my resilience inspired them, that watching me rise after such public humiliation gave them courage to face their own trials. It struck me then perhaps my story was not a failure but a lesson, not just for me but for others. Because life has a cruel way of testing us. Sometimes it comes in the form of betrayal or cruelty or laughter when you most need kindness. And in those moments we are forced to choose, will we crumble under the weight of shame, or will we rise even with champagne dripping down our cheeks and declare our worth? I chose to rise. Yet even as I thrived, I could not ignore the emptiness that lingered late at night. There were evenings when I sat alone at my table staring at the quiet, wondering if I had condemned myself to solitude forever. My parents, though supportive, sometimes sighed, wishing I might have found a gentler man, a kinder family. But I always answered the same. Happiness is something you seize for yourself, not something you wait to be handed. So I seized it. I filled my days with work, yes, but also with new joys. I began going to the gym, pushing my body in ways I had never done before. I felt strength grow not just in my muscles, but in my spirit. I began traveling not for business, but for myself, walking along beaches and mountains, breathing in the reminder that the world was wide and full of beauty beyond boardrooms and betrayal. And sometimes late at night I whispered to myself, "You are enough." The whispers about the Coleman family never truly ceased. In the business world, people talk and scandal lingers like smoke in a room long after the fire has been extinguished. I would hear fragments during meetings over lunches, whispered like gossip, but delivered with the gravity of a cautionary tale. Kelly lives alone now in a small apartment. Her old friends don't even answer her calls. John Hay works odd jobs, but he doesn't last. He can't handle the discipline. I heard his father keeps him on a short leash these days. Each piece of information came to me unbidden, as if fate wanted to remind me what I had escaped. And though I had sworn not to involve myself in their downfall, I couldn't help but reflect on the cruel symmetry of life. Kelly, who once humiliated me with champagne, now lived drenched in her own bitterness. Jan, who mocked me with laughter, now knew the sting of ridicule himself. It was never my hand that struck them down. Life itself was the avenger. But in truth, I didn't need their suffering to validate my own choices. My victory was not in their ruin. It was in my survival, my dignity, my freedom. That was something they could never take from me. And yet I won't pretend that I never felt the hollow spaces inside me. I had built walls of strength so high, so impenetrable, that even I struggled to see beyond them. Some nights, when the city outside my window was quiet, and the glow of my desk lamp flickered against the pages of another book, I would wonder, was I meant to live this life entirely alone? I remembered Jan's trembling hand when he asked me to marry him. For a fleeting second, before everything soured, I had believed in that gesture. I had let myself imagine a life where I wasn't always the strong one, where I could lean on someone else, share the weight, laugh at small joys. That dream had died with a splash of champagne. But dreams have a way of haunting you even in their graves. I learned to turn those moments of longing into fuel. When loneliness whispered, I pushed harder at work. When regret knocked, I opened new doors for my company. I poured myself into my passions until the ache dulled, until I could breathe again. It was during those years that I began to change in ways I hadn't expected. I took up exercise not just to strengthen my body, but to challenge my mind. Each repetition, each bead of sweat felt like a reclamation of power. My employees began to notice too. "Miss Hall," they would say, "you look younger, stronger. You inspire us." Their admiration embarrassed me at times, but it also reminded me that my story had meaning beyond my own pain, because in truth, what I endured was not just personal, it was universal. Who among us has not been mocked, underestimated, betrayed by those we trusted? Who has not stood in a room drenched in shame while others laughed, and who has not afterward had to decide, will I break or will I rise? I rose, and in my rising, perhaps others found the courage to rise too. 3 years after the engagement crumbled, I crossed paths with the former President Coleman once again. This time he sought me out. His once proud figure was stooped, his hair streaked with more gray, but there was a gentleness in his eyes I had not seen before. He bowed his head deeply. "Tana," he said quietly, "I failed you. I failed my company, and I failed my son. If I had been stronger, if I had been wiser, perhaps things would have been different." I looked at him, and for the first time I saw not a business partner, not a patriarch, but a man broken by the weight of his choices. There was no satisfaction in his humility, no joy in his regret, only sorrow. "You are not the only one who made mistakes," I told him softly. "I too ignored the signs. I thought I could nurture your son into something he was not. That was my folly." He nodded, his eyes glistening. Jan cries often these days. He works small jobs, learns slowly. Sometimes he looks at me like a lost child, and I realize I never taught him how to be a man. I let his mother shield him too long, and now it is too late. I wanted to tell him it was never too late, that growth could happen at any age. But I had seen Jan's eyes, those wide, fearful eyes that always sought Kelly before making a decision. And I knew the truth. Some people remain children forever, not because they cannot grow, but because they refuse to. When we parted, I felt no hatred, only closure. The Colemans would live their lives in the shadow of their choices, and I would live mine in the light of mine. By then, my company had soared to new heights. We expanded internationally, our innovations catching the attention of larger markets. My employees thrived, their loyalty stronger than ever. I was no longer just a president. I was a symbol of resilience, of integrity. And though I did not set out to be, I became a story others told when they needed courage. Still, I remained unmarried. At family gatherings, my relatives would sometimes nudge me gently, asking, "Don't you ever want someone by your side?" I would smile, though my heart ached faintly. Perhaps at the end of my life I would reply, "When all is said and done, and I have nothing left to prove, maybe then I will give myself to love without fear." Because that, I realized, was the truest lesson of all. Love is not meant to be a bargain, a transaction, a mask for weakness. It is meant to be a choice made freely without chains of dependence or illusions of status. And until I found that I would rather walk alone, there are nights even now when I lie awake and remember the sting of champagne. But instead of shame, I feel gratitude. Because in that sting I found my clarity, in their betrayal I found my strength, and in my solitude I found myself. Time, I have learned, is the gentlest avenger. It softens wounds, dulls sharp humiliations, and with each passing year replaces bitterness with clarity. The memory of champagne dripping down my face no longer burns as it once did. Instead, it has become a symbol, a moment where the curtain was pulled back, where illusions shattered, and where I finally saw the truth of people I had once trusted. The Coleman family drifted further into obscurity. Kelly, who once reveled in her wealth and status, now lives in quiet isolation. Her old companions abandoned her long ago, tired of her arrogance, unwilling to share in her fall. I sometimes imagine her sitting in her small apartment, staring at the walls that once echoed with laughter, wondering when it all slipped away. Jan remains with his father, though remains may not be the right word. He exists, a man in years, but still a child in spirit. I have heard stories of him fumbling through part-time jobs, quitting within weeks, crying when the smallest obstacle blocks his way. His father tries to teach him responsibility, but decades of dependency cannot be erased with late lessons. And I wonder sometimes if he even wants to change, or if clinging to his mommy will always feel safer than growing into his own strength. For years, people have asked me if I regret it. Do I regret saying yes to the engagement in the first place? Do I regret walking away? Do I regret closing the door so firmly that no chance of reconciliation could ever slip through? And my answer has always been the same: I regret nothing. Because regret implies that I should have chosen differently, that I should have stayed, endured, molded myself into someone who could have tolerated their cruelty. But that is not me. I was not born to be humiliated, nor to become the silent wife of a man who never grew beyond his mother's grasp. I was born to build, to lead, to carve out a life that, though unconventional, is entirely my own. Of course, there were lonely nights. Of course, there were moments I envied the simple joys of couples walking hand in hand, of families laughing together. I am not made of stone. I am a woman with a heart that longs, with a soul that aches. But I learned to fill that longing in other ways, through work, through friendships, through passions that fed me more honestly than Jan or Kelly ever could have. I learned that happiness is not a gift someone bestows upon you. It is something you create, something you seize with your own hands. The years that followed were some of the most fulfilling of my life. My company expanded beyond anything I had once dreamed. The respect I earned in my field was no longer tied to my gender or my status as a woman who had remained single. It was tied to my achievements, my vision, my resilience. People stopped asking why I hadn't married, and instead asked how I had done what so few others could. But perhaps the greatest victory was not professional, it was personal. I found peace. I began to love the rhythm of my days. The early mornings at the gym, the quiet hours in the office, the evenings spent with books or long walks beneath city lights. I began to find joy in the admiration of my employees, in the laughter of friends, in the gentle pride of my parents. My life was not the one I had imagined in my youth, but it was mine wholly and unapologetically mine. And in that truth I discovered something profound: I did not need revenge. Life had already delivered it. I did not need vindication. My dignity had already provided it. What I needed, what I always needed, was simply the courage to choose myself. Sometimes I picture that moment in Kelly's dining room again. The sting, the laughter, the silence that followed. And I imagine a different version of myself, one who broke down, one who begged, one who allowed their cruelty to define her. That woman might have walked into a marriage where her voice was smothered, her worth diminished, her future bound to a child man and a bitter mother. But that is not the story I tell today. Instead, I tell the story of a woman who rose from humiliation with her head held high. A woman who ended an engagement not out of spite, but out of self-respect. A woman who turned betrayal into fuel, who transformed pain into power, who chose to live not for others' approval, but for her own freedom. And that is why when people ask me if I am happy, I smile. Because happiness for me is not a man's promise, nor a ring on my finger, nor champagne in a glass. Happiness is waking up every day knowing that I am true to myself, that I have not compromised my worth for anyone, that I am enough. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: never let someone else's cruelty convince you of your own inadequacy. Never let their laughter silence your truth. And never ever let love or the illusion of it cost you your dignity. I once thought love would come to me as a partner, a marriage, a family. Perhaps it still might someday. Perhaps at the end of my life, when I have nothing left to prove, I will let myself fall into love's embrace one last time. But until then, I will keep building, keep striving, keep living fully. Because this is my life, and I will not waste it waiting for someone else to define it. So to those who hear my story, I say this: cherish yourself first. Respect yourself first. And if you ever find yourself standing where I once stood, mocked, betrayed, humiliated, remember that you hold the power to walk away. You hold the power to rise. And in that rising, you will find more strength, more peace, and more freedom than you ever thought possible. Thank you for listening to my story. If it moved you, if you saw even a piece of yourself in it, then please like, share, and subscribe. Leave me a comment with your thoughts, your own experiences, your lessons learned. Together we can build a place where stories of betrayal become stories of strength, where pain becomes wisdom, where no one walks alone in their scars. Because in the end, the greatest revenge is not in their downfall, it is in your survival.